God, where are you? Are you around? Are you near? Are you present? Do you see this suffering? Do you see this distance? And will you close the gap? What can you and I do when God seems distant? When God seems far away, when it seems like he's not hearing us or answering us or drawing near to us. And what we're going to see David do, I think, will be instructive, that he's going to move from this feeling that God is far away, and yet he's longing for God's presence. And we're going to see David take himself through a process where his circumstances don't change. His circumstances are going to stay the same, but his perspective is going to change. Because he can't change the external situation that he's facing, and we'll talk about that. But what he can change is the attitude and perspective of his heart. And so David is going to work himself through an exercise to draw closer to God so that by the end of this psalm, we're going to see David go from this distance between himself and God to feeling close to God again and having a renewed sense of hope and intimacy with God. And so we want to ask, what do we do when God seems like he's far away? Maybe you're there yourself even right now. Maybe you're in a place in your life right now where you say, I want to know God, I'm trying to know God, but there's something that seems to be keeping me from being close to him. And my prayer is, as we look at Psalm 63, we'll find some strategies, so to speak. Not to change our circumstances, but to change our hearts and our perspective, to recognize God is near, and we can always draw near to him. So that's what we're going to see in Psalm 63. So follow with me. I'm going to start in Psalm 63, beginning in verse 1. O God, you are my God. I shall seek you earnestly. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh yearns for you in a dry and weary land where there is no water. All right, and the superscription, I meant to read that. It says a psalm of David when he was in the wilderness of Judah. All right, so let me lay the setting out for us just for a minute. We don't know exactly what the situation was in David's life when he wrote this psalm. It says he's in the wilderness of Judah. A lot of commenters on this passage believe that David probably wrote this during the period of time in his life when he was outside of Jerusalem. He's living in the wilderness near Beersheba. And the reason he's out there is because his own son, Absalom, had initiated a coup, right? So his own son was trying to take over the kingdom. And so David was driven away from Jerusalem, and he's on the run from his own flesh and blood, living in the wilderness. Now, this wilderness area outside of Jerusalem is a true desert. Just to give you an idea, it probably got between 4 and 8 inches of rain every year. In contrast, College Station gets typically about 35 to 40 inches of rain per year, right? So 4 versus 40, that's a pretty big gap. So this is a true desert area. So here's David. He's literally in a dry land, a weary land. There is quite literally probably no water around him. He is physically thirsty. He is physically dehydrated, and he begins to cry out for God because his physical thirst becomes an illustration of his spiritual longing for God. David is literally in the wilderness, but he is also spiritually in the wilderness. Because here's King David, who has been anointed king by the prophet of God, who has been given a promise by God that he will always have the right to reign over the throne of Israel, and his descendants after him will have the right to reign on the throne of Israel, and that the house and the kingdom belong to him. But here he is, and this seeming kingdom, it's going to turn over in a way that David didn't expect or hope for, in a way that seems contrary to God's promise. It's actually being taken from him, so he is feeling like, where is God in the midst of these circumstances? David's palace, we'll talk about this in a few minutes, was probably close to the tabernacle where the glory of God was present, and now he's far away out in the wilderness. He is physically separated from God's presence. He is spiritually dry, and he is thirsty. And so he cries out. He says, God, you are my God. I know who you are. I'm longing for you. Eagerly, earnestly, or literally early in the morning in a dry and weary land where there's no water. God, where are you? Are you around? Are you near? Are you present? Do you see this suffering? Do you see this distance? And will you close the gap? And we're going to see now how David moves his heart and mind to begin to draw near to God again, even while he's in this dry and weary land. And the first thing that David's going to do is he's going to reflect on the character of God. When God seems far away, one of the greatest things that we can do is reflect on his character. Look at verses 2 through 5. He says, "Thus I have seen you in the sanctuary to see your power and your glory. Because your loving kindness is better than life, my lips will praise you. So I will bless you as long as I live. I will lift up my hands in your name. My soul is satisfied as with marrow and fatness, and my mouth offers praises with joyful lips." All right, so David says, God, when I don't feel your presence, when I don't feel you near, I'm going to remind myself of who you are. And what your character is. Instead of choosing to dwell upon thoughts that God is against me, that God is not around, that God has left me, David says, I'm going to focus on God's good character, God's good attributes, his power and his love. If you were with us a few weeks ago, Brad talked a bit about conflict management, Brad Evans, and he talked about it also like in the context of marriage. And you may remember, he discussed 4 negative patterns of communication or relationship that often we bring to our marriage, but I think they can also relate to our relationship with God, right? So you remember that acronym, WENI, W-E-N-I. He talked about those 4 characteristics. One was withdrawal, right? So when you're in an argument or there's some sort of conflict, you just withdraw. You're like, I'm done with this. You leave the house, you leave the room, you stop talking, whatever it may be. The second one was escalation. You remember escalation is when your spouse says something like, hey, sometimes I wish that you would, clean up the dishes after you use your dishes, and you go something like, well, sometimes I hate your mom, right? You escalate the conversation immediately, all right? Or negative interpretation, that is like everything the other person does, you spin it in a negative light. If they forget to take out the trash, that must be because they don't care about your house or about how it smells, right? Or even maybe positive things. They bring home flowers and you're like, what'd you do wrong, right? That's negative interpretation. And then there's invalidation. Invalidation is they say, hey, I'm feeling sad because of what you did. And you go, well, don't feel sad. That's a dumb way to feel. Right? Now, why do I share those? Because I especially think that in our relationship with God, we often engage in 2 of these. One is withdrawal. When God doesn't seem to be answering our prayers, we just stop praying. We just stop reading his word. We just withdraw. But we also engage in negative interpretation. Meaning when things are going well, we don't always attribute it to the goodness and the kindness and the love of God. Maybe we attribute it to our own goodness, our own righteousness, our own whatever. But when things are going poorly, we immediately turn to God is against me. God doesn't care about me. God doesn't see. God doesn't love me, right? We have a tendency to attribute negative characteristics to God. I've done that before in my own life. I remember as a young man at one point, Shannon and I were very, very low on money. And I was about to start seminary, about to start grad school. And I mean, we were just kind of right there on the line between solvency and insolvency at any particular moment. And we were driving out of town to a friend's wedding. And on the way there, man, my car it just died. The engine just went kaput. One of the cylinders or something just was gone. And so we had to put a whole new engine in that car. And I remember standing on the side of the road thinking, I don't have the money to fix this. I don't know where it's going to come from. I don't know how God's going to provide. And I remember thinking, it feels to me right now like God is trying to squish me or keep me from moving forward. That was one of the first things that came into my mind. Maybe you've had that kind of moment. And so to counteract that, here's what David does. He says, I'm going to remember, God, who you are, who I know that you are. And he says, hey, I've seen your power and your glory. I've been in your sanctuary. Remember, I said David's palace was near the tabernacle. At this point, there probably wasn't a full-blown temple, but the tabernacle was still there with the Ark of the Covenant and the Holy of Holies. And so the people of Israel could actually see the cloud shining with the glory of God. And he says, I've been there. I've seen your glory. I know that you exist. And then he says, your loving kindness, and this is a word we've talked about a few times this summer, his hesed, your loving kindness, your faithful love, it's better than life. God, I know you exist, and I know you love me. You've made promises to your people, and you've always kept your promises. I know that you exist, and I know that you love me. So he says, here's the character of God. And as David begins to rehearse the character of God, it says he begins to praise God, right? So his joy goes from his mind, this shift of perspective, goes from his mind and his heart to his body. He begins to lift up his hands and he begins to praise with his mouth. He begins to sing praises. It transforms his perspective. Instead of believing a lie that God is against him, he says, God, I know who you are. I'm going to reflect on your character. For me, when I'm in the midst of these moments, sometimes it helps me to reflect upon the death and resurrection of Jesus. To say, if God himself was willing to come and be among us because he loved the world and he loved me, and he died in my place, he must love me. And the fact that he rose again, that validates that he is stronger and more powerful than whatever I'm facing today. And so the death and the resurrection of Jesus validates for us that God is powerful, that God is real, and that God loves us. And so we can reflect on the death and resurrection of Christ on our behalf. And then we can do as David does, and as we did this morning, we begin to sing praise. There's some sort of connection between our minds and our hearts and our bodies, isn't there? Where when we begin to sing and we begin to raise our hands, that affects the way we feel. And when we respond in gratitude by singing and raising our hands before God, then we move into a space of gratitude rather than despair. And so David says, the first thing I'm going to do is reflect on the character of God.